Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second panel of the day. This panel is titled Managing Human Impacts on the Environment. We have four lovely presenters today. Taylor Baxter, Kristin Anderson, Paul Rivera, and Sabrina Lucero. So we will begin with 5 minutes going over providing an overview of the panel, and then each panelist will have 13 minutes to present, followed by 2 minutes of question and answer for that specific panelist. Once everyone has presented, we will then end with 10 minutes of question and answer for the whole panel. You can please submit questions with the QR code on the back of the chairs. It should be provided up here as well. Please note we are running 5 minutes behind schedule, so we will end at noon today. Without further ado, our panelists.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sabrina. This is Paul, Kristin, and Taylor, and our panel is looking at managing human impacts on the ecosystem. Outdoor recreation is common, and it's continuing to increase throughout the United States. Outdoor recreation is often encouraged by health experts because it's very beneficial to human health, both mentally and physically. Unfortunately, outdoor recreation can have a lot of negative impacts on both the environment and wildlife species. In fact, outdoor recreation is the leading factor of the endangerment of flora and fauna species around the globe. Outdoor recreational activities include hunting, hiking, ATV riding, mountain biking, along with numerous other activities. Our projects are dialing in on the impacts of outdoor recreation to help manage and mitigate. My project is focusing on trail-based recreation and its impacts on ungulate species.
My project is creating and designing a standardized roadkill survey protocol to increase inaccuracies in currently used methods.
My project looks at impacts to the environment from recreation, specifically camping in the state of Maine.
I'm Taylor Baxter, and my project is looking at the human impacts on BLM designated areas of critical environmental concern. So who out here likes recreating? Just raise your hand. Any type of recreating. I know it's awesome. We all love it. But unfortunately, it does have impacts. And my project is looking at how those different recreation activities impact these areas that are extremely sensitive. In 1999, the Oahe Field Office, which is the field office that I did my project in southwestern Idaho, signed their resource management plan. And in it, they designated 12 areas as areas of critical environmental concern, or ACECs. This entire resource area encompasses 1,779,492 acres of land, and it is mostly contiguous. And the total acreage of the designated ACECs is 1,667,372. Wow, I cannot talk this morning. More coffee. So let's try that again. 1,067 and 372 acres. Here we go. So what is an ACEC? So that is the acronym, because government loves their acronyms, for areas of critical environmental concern. So ACECs are highlighted areas of things that special status animals, plants, fish, wildlife, other natural resources, including cultural resources. And they are only designated, well, caveat there, only designated typically during the resource management planning period. They can be designated afterwards. There's a long process to create an amendment for that resource management plan. But the management of these ACECs is laid out in the management plan. There's like huge tables that say how to manage them. And it is guided by the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976, or FLPMA. So in this map, here is Idaho, and then Oahe right here is the area that I worked in for the BLM as an outdoor recreation planner, pathways intern for the last year. So these are some of the ACECs. So Jump Creek Canyon, about 612 acres, Neway Creek Research Natural Area, 150, Cinnabar, 277 are the ones that I was able to get before all the plants went to sleep pretty much. And then next week, actually not next week, the week after, I will be going to at least these top two. And then I would really like to go out to the Tules, but it is 6 hours away from any civilization. So hopefully we'll get out there. So during this process, I learned that these areas have not been monitored in a really long time. They didn't have a good program for monitoring or a protocol for monitoring. So this first sheet over here, so that is for special status plants only. There's also one for animals, cultural stuff, but it's really complicated. It's not very user-friendly. So then I tried to create another monitoring report for the specific ACEC that's a little more user-friendly, can still be used by specialists that have a little more information. So mostly livestock, because livestock grazing is a big part of this area in the BLM. And then recreation. OHV use is very, very popular for Oahe Field Office. We have over 1 million miles of ACEC2 tracks. So a lot of UTV use, and that includes in these ACECs. And this is the pointer. There we go. So this is within one of those ACECs, the new A1. You can see where people have rutted out trying to get up to the top of the ACEC because it is on a plateau. So here's some more impacts from within some of the ACECs. Again, those 2 tracks. Can't hit the button. There we go. Whoop. So 2 tracks. And then we've got trash. That is a huge issue as well in these ACECs, trash. So trying to figure out how to mitigate for trash. And then we do have some really nice unimpacted sagebrush steppe areas. So this is actually the same ACEC as this. So it's kind of crazy how you can have like really bad impacts and then you get up to the top and there's very minimal. And then this round spike cat eyes is one of our special status plants. It's real fun and it only grows in this one particular area. Whoop. Up at the top, that really rocky, sandy soil. Oh, that wasn't supposed to happen. Go away. There it goes. Okay. So my presentation is really going to focus on Jump Creek because it is probably the most popular ACEC because it is also a special recreation management area or SRMA. It's about 45 minutes to an hour from Boise. So it's really accessible. It's absolutely beautiful. Waterfall, really easy track down to get to the waterfall. So like kids do it. all that kind of stuff. And you can see, so Boise is like up here, that little dot right there, and then there is Jump Creek. So, and then this is the waterfall that people hike to. There's a little pool down at the bottom, and there's like kind of like a sandy beach, so you can like sit, camp, picnic, you can go for a swim. It's a really, really pretty area. So in terms of recreation, it has been impacted quite heavily. So this first map is from 2002, and it shows just some of the trails up at the top. That is like the parking lot, and then some of the trails coming off of it. And at this point, these are mostly hiking trails. So footpaths / cow paths that people have used. And then in 2015, there was a huge fire called the Soda Fire, and it impacted this area very heavily. So the really nice intact sagebrush landscape was destroyed, and it is very heavily covered in cheatgrass now. And cheatgrass is a lot easier to drive your UTV and ATV through than sagebrush. So you can see, so this is the fall after that fire, how this trail has just exploded, and it continues on. But people are now taking their UTVs, ATVs through here. And because it is an ACEC, UTVs are not actually allowed in this area. It is for foot traffic only, foot traffic and horseback. So this is an issue that we are currently working on. This area is becoming a fee site probably in August of this coming year. And we are creating a plan with the Parks and Rec Department in Idaho to help reestablish some sagebrush and to kind of rehab this trail into more of a footpath instead of this 2-track that it's become. It's actually becoming where you can almost take a SUV down it. So, and you can see here, it does have an official parking lot now in 2016. And then just, it has grown. There's more trails coming down the canyon. So we're trying to figure out a way to mitigate that, to keep it as beautiful and pristine for everyone to enjoy. Now, doing field work, sometimes things go very, very wrong. So at the beginning, I had those couple that I hadn't made it to the North Fork and the Pleasant Valley table. This was me trying to get out there. Unfortunately, they are very high elevation areas, and it's muddy. So with this, I realized, hey, it's not just recreationists that cause impacts. It's also us who are out there trying to do the monitoring. And so now I'm trying to come up with a way to, hey, how can I minimize my impacts or other monitoring impacts? Because these monitoring protocols are probably going to go to like contractors to go out and monitor. So how do we get them out there without them getting stuck for 6 hours in mud that just keeps filling in every time you try to dig your truck out? We had some very lovely farmers that tried to help us, and then the field office finally showed up to help dig me and my coworker out. But yeah, so it's an ongoing process, monitoring and trying to mitigate so many different areas is very difficult. So some of the ACECs have high recreation use, like Jump Creek, and then some have very little recreation use, like the North Fork and Pleasant Valley, because those areas are harder to get to. Case in point, a lot of the recreation seen in those areas is actually hunting. And while yes, hunters do have impacts, mostly trash. And when they don't pick up their shells and stuff, So we're working with USGS to come up with a way to monitor these streams that run through some of these areas for like excess lead left by hunters and stuff, and making sure that like animals aren't impacted by that kind of stuff. So, but yeah, I just want to thank Sally Thode, who's been my mentor and has dealt with me and all of my breakdowns while trying to work 40 hours a week and do this. And then from the Bureau of Land Management, Jessa Davis, who was my community sponsor, Ryan Holman, who was the outdoor rec planner that I worked with very closely, and then Ammon Wilhelm, who was our field manager, who also helped me coordinate things. So thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. We have a few minutes for questions. So if anyone has questions, please make sure to upload those to Slido, please. And I can ask you a question.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm wondering, one of the things you mentioned was updating need around monitoring protocols and ECs. What are your some of your primary recommendations for those needed updates?
So one of the big things is making it way more user friendly. Because it's really hard to have someone who doesn't have a background in that go out and like do a monitor. So we're trying to make it to where, you know, like a citizen scientist could come out and do a monitoring day. So we have a form that's, I didn't put in the slideshow and I should have, but it's way more general, just kind of like, hey, what are your observations? Like, what do you see? Plants, animals, any thoughts, you know, that kind of stuff for like the everyday person.
Thank you. Question from the audience. What ideas do you have for minimizing the impact of contractors, staff, potentially volunteers, doing monitoring?
So the biggest thing is education, especially if you are not from the area. So I am not from Idaho, very far from Idaho. I'm originally from Tennessee. So I did not realize just how muddy and gross it gets up there. Whereas, you know, the main road was pretty fine. That side road, we were good. And then suddenly we were in mud. So definitely having a backup plan and realizing that if you're going during this time of year, you're probably going to be hiking in about 5 miles.
No. Another question, I'm kind of still attached to this idea of the story you were telling with the particular ACEC, Jump Creek. What are the proposed strategies for those newly created user trails, you know, two-path trails? What is the plan moving forward with that ACEC?
Yeah, so a nice thing is that that area still falls under the Soda Fire Rehabilitation Plan. So our plan, which we're still working on it, but we have some ideas about bringing in and planting more sagebrush, kind of trying to create those trails to be single track, you know, foot traffic only, a little more signage, and more education is going to be the big thing. And with it becoming a fee site, so it's going to be a fee site here soon, we'll be able to put out more signs and have more educational days and be able to hopefully keep people from loving the area to death.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Taylor. Great work. And next we'll hear from Kristin Anderson.
This seemed like a good spot for Taylor. I'll go here too. Welcome to Maine, everybody. Just like close your eyes and imagine sea mist and rocky cliffs. This is one of my work sites. I did a visitor use management study at 2 camping areas on Maine's public lands. And I worked with the Maine Bureau of Parks and Lands. So Maine has very little federal land. Acadia National Park is the biggest and most well-known. So I was working on state public land. My project area is in the Down East and Acadia region in Maine. This is a really heavily trafficked area for tourism. And so my project sites were at Cutler Public Land, which is the easternmost circle. And that has like a 10-mile backpacking loop with 5 designated campsites. And then the westernmost circle is Donnell Public Land, which has like a walk-in backcountry camping like campground and called Schoodic Beach camping area. And for reference, the star on the map is Acadia National Park. Anybody here been to Acadia National Park fans? Very few of you. So what's the problem? Why did I work with the Bureau of Parks and Lands? So I worked with the Bureau of Parks and Lands to identify 2 camping areas that they've been struggling to manage, and they call them hot spots. These areas are receiving really high visitation and potentially high levels of impact, but they have a lack of data of how many people are actually using these spaces and what those impacts actually are. So my job was to come up with methods to collect visitor use data at each location, then create methods to survey current campsite conditions and impacts, and then develop monitoring protocols, and then develop a visitor survey to assess visitor experience and preferences, and then finally research mitigation strategies for camping impacts. So the first thing I did was look into the management objectives of these locations. So Maine has, like the Forest Service and BLM, management plans for each of their areas. And so my 2 sites are within the Down East Regional Management Plan area, which has now expired and is up for renewal. So in 2007, this document specifies that Cutler Public Lands is to be managed primarily as an ecological reserve, which is our highest level of protection. So this conserved land was set aside specifically to conserve and to protect unique ecological values, which is the top picture on this slide. It's a mixed spruce fir coastal forest ecosystem. The secondary allocation and management purpose was to provide backcountry non-mechanized recreation for the public and provide a wilderness-like experience, because we don't have designated wilderness, and opportunities for solitude. That was specifically lined out in the management plan. Schoodic Beach, on the other hand, is its opposite. So this area is primarily managed as developed recreation. So, and also is managed to retain its semi-remote character. And by semi-remote character, this is a walk-in campsite area with 7 designated campsites. You walk a half-mile from a parking lot on an old road, or you can access it by boat on a 3-mile boat ride. My presentation today is primarily going to focus on Cutler Public Lands, and that's because my methods had to be different for each site, and I was able to collect a lot of data last summer and last fall for Cutler Public Lands, so it's much more interesting. And continuing monitoring will be happening at Schoodic Beach this year. So first, I had to figure out how to figure out how many people are using this place and collect visitor use data. So Cutler Public Lands has a self-registration at the kiosk at the trailhead. There are a lot of these across the country. I'm sure you guys have seen one and blown right by it. So the self-registration form is for both day use, day hikers, and overnight campers. So for me, I wanted to know how accurate this might be and what kind of data I could get from these to provide to the Bureau of Parks and Lands. So I conducted site visits on the weekends to observe how people use that kiosk and how they register. And as you can expect, day hikers don't always sign in. there's not a lot of incentive to do that. Overnight users though, because there are only 5 designated campsites on this loop and you're required to stay in one of those designated campsites, every backpacking group used the registration form on my site visits. I was also able to hike the trail to see where people were landing, where they were camping. Because interestingly, I'll just talk a little bit about capacity. I was able to extract and transcribe data from June through September, so 4 months. Over those 4 months, there were 431 camping trips, camping groups. And 40% of those nights between those 4 months were above or at capacity of 5 or more groups. And then interestingly, I just had to bump down to the last slide that September had 25 out of its 30 nights at or above capacity. 83% of the camping groups stay for only 1 night, and an additional 14% stayed for only 2 nights. So these are really quick trips. It's a small loop. And big for management is that only 27% of the visitors list a specific campsite. They all have names. These 3 in particular, these are called the Ferry Head 1, 2, and 3. They received the most registrations. So of the people who put anything in that destination category on that self-registration sheet, most people wanted to go to these 3 campsites, which was really interesting to me because these 3 campsites turned out to have the smallest impacts when I went to go measure impacts. Oh, I also wanted to mention that visitation was concentrated, of course, this is very obvious, but I feel like I should state it, around weekends and holidays. So those at capacity and over capacity nights were often on those predictable timeframes. So next, I developed survey methods and monitoring protocols. And lucky for me, I had some resources to help me develop those. So Dr. Jeff Marion of Virginia Tech University conducted a very similar study, and he's done this all over the country. But in particular, I was looking at his study done on Isla Ho off the coast of Acadia National Park. It's actually part of Acadia National Park and has a very similar ecosystem. And so part of those methods was to choose impact indicators. This is one of my campsites, trees with exposed roots. This is an area with really soft soils and easily compacted from camping activities. So I chose campsite area in square feet, which is the biggest indicator of campsite activities and impacts. Vegetation loss, exposed soil, and number of trees with exposed roots. There were other indicators, but I focused on these big ones. I just wanted to show, because square, the area of a campsite just indicates, it's like one of the biggest indicators for impacts. Those 3 Ferry Head campsites here on the right show that there are between 450 to 860-ish square feet in those most popular campsites. And that's because these have really interesting features that naturally contain camping activities and prevent spreading and expansion. Whereas, and these were the 3 original campsites at this site that have been there for decades. Long Point and Black Point, those first 2 closest to the trailhead, those are between almost 4,000 square feet and over 5,000 square feet, and they've really expanded. And these are new campsites that were added between 10 and 15 years ago. The last step was to develop visitor surveys. And this was done, I did 2, 1 for each site. They're really different sites and they're managed really differently. So I worked with a woman named Becca Stanley. She's a social scientist. I'm not a social scientist. And she worked with me weekly for many, many weeks to develop this survey. And I'm really grateful. It turned out, I'm really pleased with it. We focused on trip details, like number of people, where you're going, whether you shared a campsite, that kind of stuff that management would love to know. But also it's looking at the trip experiences and people's preferences. So one thing I'm really excited to learn about, this won't be deployed until 2024 and will be paired with some site visits to that Scudic Beach campsite area that needs more data. So one thing I'm really excited to learn about is we put a importance and satisfaction section in here. So how important was the condition of your campsite, availability of flat tent spots, wayfinding, solitude, how important were those things to you? And what was your satisfaction level with those? And so this will give a voice to the campers and to the people using these spaces during the management planning process. And so I'd like to wrap up by saying, like, why collect this data? Why is this important? Really, just to provide a proactive and adaptive management planning process. And so the state of Maine has one senior planner who writes all of these management plans, and there is one recreation planner to serve the entire state. So we don't generally have the capacity to perform this kind of analysis at these sites. So these really impacted sites generally don't see any management changes that could mitigate these impacts. We just don't have the capacity to do that. So I adopted, this was kind of a test. We wanted to try to use the visitor use management framework, which has been adopted by federal land management agencies like the National Forest Service, Park Service, et cetera. So this is an iterative process. It's kind of a cycle, but I was able to help my organization, the Bureau of Parks and Lands, build the foundation. So clarify the purpose and the need of a project. And then also assess current baseline conditions and gather data. And then the second stage, defining visitor use management direction. And that's a lot of like comparing your desired management conditions with the baseline conditions on the ground. And then step 3, I was really able to hone in on some management strategies for them to consider during their management planning process in the next year. And so step 4, that's up to the Bureau of Parks and Lands, as they start to implement, choose some strategies, and then monitor in the future. So I hope that my work, the frameworks I set up for monitoring in the future, will help them not just like monitor conditions over time, but monitor their strategies that they've chosen to use. So finally, I would like to thank my project sponsor, Rex Turner, who really helped me develop a project in like crunch time last summer. Dr. Brooke Zanatel, who is an incredible mentor, who not only met me on the academic and professional level, but also a really personal level and helped push me through to this final product. Friends of Acadia, Becca Stanley, a social scientist. I could not have done such a high quality visitor use survey instrument without her. And then I did partner a little bit with John Daigle, Dr. John Daigle from the University of Maine. He's a social scientist and he studies social science and recreation at the university. And he provided a lot of review and brainstorming sessions with me. And then finally, Dr. Jeff Marion from Virginia Tech University, who just retired, who provided a lot of resources for me, including computer programs that allowed me to calculate and measure impacts. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristin. So again, for any of our panelists, please submit questions via the app. I do have a few here. Do you envision either of the locations you studied that might need to go to a reservation or permit-based system to reduce overcrowding and degradation?
That's a really good question. I think when we think about mitigating or minimizing impacts, we immediately think of, as land managers, we jump to this, like, do we need to control access? And I think there's a lot of research that says that can be really effective. Controlling the timing, the number, and the spatial, like the spaces that people can use can really minimize impacts. So I think those methods require a lot of capacity. And so these sites, I didn't specify this in the beginning, but the Maine's public lands are unstaffed and they don't have rangers on the ground like a state park would or a national park would. So a lot of my research on mitigation strategies focused around containment by like campsite design. And I think that the Bureau of Parks and Lands has discussed reservations as a way to, especially on that Cutler Public Lands location, to try to, because you can imagine you get to the kiosk and You can't really you sign in and you see 4 groups ahead of you, but maybe they didn't tell you where they were going. So you're just walking along the 10-mile loop and you might just be like, I'm tired. I'm just going to share this campsite with someone. So then you're just kind of like expanding your footprint. And so there has been discussion about a reservation system, but it always comes back to capacity.
Awesome, thank you. That's all we have time for questions now, and we'll move on to Paul Rivera's presentation.
Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Rivera. I'm a master's of environmental management student. Heads up, my presentation does contain images of roadkill. So if anybody's uncomfortable seeing roadkill or any reason, I will not be here if you walk out right now. But just a heads up. So the goal of my project is to pilot test a new rigorous survey protocol that will possibly be adopted by Colorado Parks and Wildlife and Colorado Department of Transportation. This will solidify, repair, and repair inconsistencies that are currently being seen in these methods. Currently, CPW and CDOT do not have a standardized roadkill survey. This leaves many WVCs, wildlife vehicle collisions, unaccounted for. My main focus is here in Gunnison on Highway 50 and Highway 135. So you may ask, why do we care about roadkill surveys? By identifying roadkill survey hotspots, we can implement management techniques such as wildlife corridors, such as no overpass or underpass. As we all know, here in Gunnison, we also have the threatened Gunnison sage grouse. This came on a little bit later on in my project from a couple people at CPW wanting to understand corvid use, raven use on these carcasses in the wintertime. Just a quick question. How many of you have actually hit a deer or elk in the Gunnison area? 2, 3, 4. How many has hit one from January 1st till March 28th? Anybody? Okay, so you're not going to be a statistic in my presentation. So on average, the average cost of hitting a deer is around $1,800 nationwide. In Gunnison, if we just do a quick calculation, it would have costed the people of Gunnison around $215,000 this year from January 1st to March 28th. So this is my survey protocol. This was the main focus of my project, was designing this protocol. I did my surveys once a week, traveling between various speeds of 35 to 50 miles an hour. I would travel on the shoulder of the highway and conduct them at various speeds. Here are my controlled variables up here. Here are my uncontrolled variables. Everything listed here was on my Survey 123 app. Start and stop to figure out how long it would take, date and time of survey, highway I was on, speed of travel, notes, weather, nearest mile marker, location. Location here is the biggest one that we do not see with CPW and CDOT. Currently, what we see is there were 20 mortalities between so-and-so mile marker to so-and-so mile marker, which doesn't really help anybody. Cause of mortality, touching pavement, side of road, visible from road. Cause of mortality, I have this because last year was a hard winter, as we all know. We had a lot of mortalities happen from starvation. Here, you may wonder why this deer is painted orange. This is so I don't double count carcasses on my next survey. Up here, we have my survey route. I'll start here in Gunnison by the McDonald's, which is mile marker 158. I'll travel on the south side of the highway all the way to Sargent, which is mile marker 189. Turn around there, travel the shoulder of the north side of the highway up all the way up to Gunnison again, ending at this spot right here. I would not do a survey in town. I'll start my survey right here, going west of Gunnison on mile marker 156. And I'll go all the way down, traveling the north side of the highway on the shoulder up to right here. There's a seed out barn, and this is mile marker 131. I would then again travel the south side of the highway all the way back to Gunnison, stopping right here. This is right here is the bridge by the water park, for those of you that know the area. Not do a survey through here. I'll start my survey here. I'm on marker 1 right by Walmart, and I'll travel the east side of the highway all the way to Jackson Cabin turnoff, which is mile marker 15. Turn around, do the same thing all the way back. This whole trip is about 152 miles, and doing the survey alone without counting the time here would take about 4 hours and 46 minutes. Each individual survey at the carcass would take 1 minute, 10 seconds. That's from getting out of the vehicle, conducting the carcass and survey on the carcass and getting back in the vehicle. These are deer and elk mortalities, my deer and elk mortalities, deer being in red, elk being in blue, going east towards Sargent's. Here, like right here would be a good spot to put a corridor, right here would another be a good spot, and right in here. As you can see, there are quite a few mortalities in these stretches. On this stretch alone, it takes about 1 hour and 56 minutes to conduct this survey from start to finish on this stretch. This year I had 77 mortalities, 57 being deer, 20 being elk. If we look right here, we can see as the season progressed into March, mortalities increased as elk mortalities decreased. This is due to snow melt. As the snow melted away, the elk also went up into the hills. This is on the west side of Gunnison, going towards Blue Mesa. Again, deer and elk. You can see that right in here. We have kind of a lot of mortalities, good corridor right in here too. Not so much in this stretch here. Oops. On this stretch, it takes about 1 hour and 40 minutes. We have 35 total mortalities, 26 being deer, 9 being elk. Same exact trend on the west side, except for elk peaking here in February for the stretch of highway. And yeah. Okay, so this is not Highway 50 East. This is actually Highway 135 north of town. Here's Almont, those of you that are familiar with the area. As we can see, there's quite a few mortalities in this stretch right here. Those of us that are from the area or seen the elk, they hang out here. This is kind of a big corridor for deer and elk. 1 mortality up here and 1 mortality right here. Not too many. We had a total of 5 mortalities this year, 3 being deer, 2 being elk. Highest mortalities being in February and 1 mortality of deer being in March. So this is total counted, my total counted survey mortalities here in the Gunnison Basin. If we look here, this is a cluster. This is another cluster right here, cluster right there. So these are kind of hot spots. These are pretty important if we're a land manager. So total findings from January 1st to March 28th, we had 117 wild vehicle collisions. These are mortalities caused by hitting an animal. 73.5% were deer, 21.5% were elk. If we look, mainly females on both deer and elk were getting hit, not too many males. Here we can see that more adults on both ends were getting hit. We had 27 adults and 4 juveniles. So findings, as we look here, we can see that total mortalities happened in February and March for deer, kind of being the same. But for elk though, whenever the snow dissipated, mortalities in March really slowed down. As we can also see a trend here on speeds, as the snow went out and more bare ground was shown, speed had to be slower. The average speed was around 40.1 miles an hour. So why is this important? This right here is CPW's and CDOT's points. This is every single one that they had this year. Green and blue are the same points that I counted and CPW counted. If we look right in here, I didn't survey these because this was out of my survey route. But as we can just see, there's not very many. A lot of stuff is getting missed. It's leaving Gunnison very underrepresented. On this right here, we can see this is CDOT's and this is CBW's and this is my survey. Highway 50 East, they're missing a ton of animals out on this stretch. Highway 50 West, not as many. Clayton actually did a really good job this year counting roadkill on that stretch of highway. 135 to Crested Butte. CPW or CDOT didn't even count 1 elk in the stretch. There was 3 elk, and they were still short on deer. So in blue is state, which are going to be CPW and CDOT. Gray is my survey. If we look, they're quite a big difference between the two. This is leaving a lot of wildlife vehicle collisions being unaccounted for, leaving Gunnison being very underrepresented. This is the same map again that I just showed you guys of all of CPW and CDOT's points. These are all my points. If we go back and forth, we can just see there's a drastic difference between the two. Here is CBW's, CDOT's and my points combined. If we look, this area is very underrepresented. There's not one survey that was done in this stretch for CBW or CDOT, especially right in here. So if we were in the future thinking about putting a wildlife corridor in this stretch, we would be like, we wouldn't need to because no animals are getting hit. But obviously, there is something wrong with our protocol right now, and it needs to be fixed because a lot of these areas being underrepresented. Another aspect of my project was kind of counting ravens. This came on a little later in the year, didn't come on until February 16th, whenever CBW wanted to find out how ravens are using these carcasses. If we look at this right here, from January 1st to the end of my project, 34% of total mortalities had ravens present. There was 41.9% of total elk had ravens present, 27.9% of deer had ravens present. You may ask, why is this important? This is important because in the wintertime, the ravens don't have to leave the valley. They are actually staying in the valley and they're able to just mass populate. And now in the springtime, whenever the Gunnison sage grouse are having chicks, the ravens are actually eating a lot of the chicks out on the landscape. Please keep in mind that these numbers are only counts of new carcasses. If I had already did a survey and there was ravens on another carcass, I didn't count them. I just kept going by. So this number is actually very low on Volt. I did see elk that had ravens present for up to like 3 months and they were just eating on nothing. And then I saw fresh roadkill that didn't have any ravens. Just a warning, this is going to show some pre-graphic images. Just a heads up. As we can see here, roadkill is not pretty. It doesn't discriminate. Up here we have adult elk, we have juvenile elk right in here. We have juvenile deer. We have adult deer here. So anywhere from an old mature animal to a very young deerling. This is just the sad reality of it. And hopefully in the future, we can have measurement techniques that will, hopefully in the future, we won't have stuff like this. We'll actually have corridors, or at least have a good estimate on what's happening out there. I give a special thanks to the following people: Kevin Blecka, he was my community sponsor. He helped with the idea, design, and implementation. Bridget Estep, she is my mentor. Cinnamon Levi Flynn, she's a Region 3 Colorado Farmer Transportation Biologist. Clayton Bondurant, he's right here. He actually went out with me on a few surveys. He helped me with anything I needed. Sabrina, Logan, and Eleanor, they're all my observers, and they're a great help this year. And I also like to thank GoCo, CBW, and Center for Public Lands. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And just a quick story. Many of you may not know, Paul was able to help me collect some better quality roadkill hides for one of my classes that had a hide tanning workshop. So thanks again for driving out and teaching me how to skin deer and elk hide. I appreciate that. So we have a few questions, and some of which are technical for you, Paul. One question. How were you able to determine the speed of vehicles hitting deer and elk, or approximate the speed?
Yes, I actually wasn't approximating the speed of what these animals were getting hit at. That was the approximate speed of my travel for the observation. So the 35 to 50 miles an hour was my speed of travel whenever I was actually doing the observations for roadkill.
Awesome, thanks. And how many days did you survey versus CPW and CDOT?
Yes, that's the big problem here. CPW and CDOT, they only opportunistically collect data. So it's very sporadic. They don't have a set days like, I have an hour today, I'm gonna go do this little stretch. So that's why we're seeing a lot of inaccuracies in the data. I did it every week from January 10th to March 28th. So that's kind of the goal here, is kind of having a standardized roadkill survey protocol to not have so many mortalities getting unaccounted for.
Another short question. How was the cost associated with roadkills determined?
Yeah, so I just did kind of just the average. Of course, we're gonna have semis, we're gonna have other stuff, vehicles with brush guards that are not gonna have any damage. So what I did was kind of just did a low ball. I multiplied the average cost by 117 to kind of get the rough estimate, just because I don't have because I don't know what hit what and then what actually got fixed, what didn't get fixed, et cetera. That's just a rough estimate.
Okay, awesome. That's all the time we have right now. And so I'm going to welcome to the stage Sabrina Lucero.
Is the pointer with that? Hello, everyone. Once again, my name is Sabrina Lucero. I'm an employee student here at Western Colorado University. This means I'm doing 2 master's degrees. One is a master's of environmental management and another is an MS in ecology. Today, I'm going to be presenting on my thesis project, ungulate flight behavioral responses to trail-based recreational activities in the Gunnison Basin. So, as we've heard throughout this entire panel presentation, recreation and human impacts can have big negative impacts on the environment. I'm going to be talking about the impacts of recreation on ungulates. We can divide these impacts into 2 groups, short-term impacts and long-term impacts. We see short-term impacts all the time as we're walking on trails and approaching maybe a deer. These include a fleeing response, an increased heart rate, and a change in their current habitat selection. So as we approach a deer, it gets nervous and it runs away. The long-term impacts are a lot harder to understand, but past researchers have suggested that long-term impacts of recreation include altered reproductive patterns, increased fawn mortalities or decreased productivity, and a change in daily activities. These come when the stresses of recreation occur over and over and over again. The biggest impact of long-term recreational effects can lead to mortality. So for this project, I did experimental observations of ungulates in the high alpine of the Gunnison Basin. Results from this study can help managers determine things like trail densities, trail closures, and if a trail should be added to an area or not. These are really difficult to come by management decisions, and increased data can help managers come to them. This is my project site. For the most part, I remained in the Gunnison Basin in GMUs 55, 67, and 66. For those who don't know, GMUs are game management units. I stayed in these areas for a few reasons. One was accessibility, and another was because these areas had good high alpine areas above 11,000 feet. So I was either typically north of Crested Butte or south of Lake City. My response variables help me determine the levels of disturbance the ungulates are experiencing. These include alert distance, flight initiation distance, and flood distance. Alert distance is the distance from a recreationist when the target individual becomes aware of the recreationist. This behavior includes maybe they pick their heads up, point their ears towards the recreationist, or even just turn and look directly at the recreationist. Flight initiation distance is the distance from the recreationist when target individuals begin to move away from the recreationists. These behaviors are a little bit harder to identify, but they might include the animals taking a couple nervous steps away, or maybe if they're in a laying position, they stand up. And fled distance. This is the distance from the recreationist when target individuals flee in response to the recreationists. This is the easiest to identify behavior. The animals simply turn away and move quickly or run away from the recreationists. My explanatory variables include my control variables and my uncontrolled variables. So my controlled variables were the variables that I myself controlled. These include noise levels. So sometimes when I'd have my recreators approach the ungulates, I'd have them talk loudly, sometimes talk quietly, or not talk at all. The number of recreators, this was predetermined. So sometimes I'd send out one recreator, sometimes two. And dog presence. About 50% of the time, I sent a dog out with my recreators. My uncontrolled variables are the variables that I can't control, but they might have an impact on the response variables. These include wind speed and direction. So if the wind is blowing real hard from the recreator to the ungulates, maybe they are alert sooner because they can smell them or they can hear the recreator coming. General weather conditions, is it snowing? Is it cloudy? Is it clear? Number of ungulates in the group. So is a large group of ungulates or deer and elk going to be reacting differently to recreators than maybe if it's just a pair? And finally, the temperature of the outside. So I've just thrown a ton of variables at you guys, and you might be trying to figure out, how does this project work? So for this project to work, I need a minimum of 2 people out in the field. Each person will have a job. One is going to be the observer, and the other is going to be the recreator. Once ungulates are spotted in the high alpine, the observer is going to remain out of sight of the ungulates, but keep a good line of vision so they can observe the behaviors. These behaviors include the response variables: alert distance, flight initiation distance, and flood distance. They're going to communicate these with the recreator using a walkie-talkie. And as the recreator is approaching in a straight line, the ungulates, they're going to drop a marker at alert distance, flight initiation distance, and flood distance. Once the animals have fled, we'll send the recreator to the initial location of the deer or elk and take those measurements. So this might be a little bit hard to still understand. So I went ahead and created a little animation to hopefully make it a little bit easier. As we can see up here in this top corner, we have some deer. We have our observer here in the tree line, out of sight, but with a good line of vision to the deer, and our recreator who's getting ready to walk. Our recreator is going to move and drop a marker at each response variable. Our deer are going to flee, and then we're going to take those measurements. And finally, I wanted to give you guys a good idea of what this might look like from the recreator's point of view. So here the recreator's walking up, the elk are already alert to the recreator. As we zoom in, we can see a little bit, sorry, it's wobbly, a little bit of flight initiation distance. One stood up, they're getting ready to flee, and right there, they're all going to flee. So the recreator is going to stop. They're going to allow the elk to get out of the way so we don't disturb them further as we go back to that initial distance, initial location of the elk. This was also one of my favorite days out in the field. The elk normally don't let us get that close. So over the course of this summer, I collected 54 deer observations. A linear model analysis informed me that deer are alert to recreators from further distances when they're more than a half-mile away from any trail or road. As deer group size increases, flight initiation distance also increases. And finally, as noise increases, deer will flee from a further distance. So management implications of this might mean that building trails in areas that are over a half-mile away from any other trail or road is going to cause a big disturbance to deer. Here's a few graphs to help you better understand these results. So in this alert distance graph, we can see that this column is over a half-mile away from any trail or road. This is within a half-mile from any trail or road. So deer are alert from further distances when they're further than a half-mile from any trail or road. Flight initiation distance, our x-axis, is the ungulate group size, And over here is our flight initiation distance. So as ungulate group size increases, so does flight initiation distance. And finally, this bottom x-axis is the noise level. Here's flood distance. As noise increases, flood distance does as well. Over the course of the past summer, I collected 34 elk observations. My results showed that elk are alert to recreators from further distances when they're more than a half-mile away from any other trail or road. We learned that noise increases, flight initiation distance also increases. And finally, dog presence decreases the amount of time between when an elk is alert to a recreator and the time that they flee. I call this the interval time. So once again, it's the time between when an animal is alert and when they flee. Management implications of this include that building a new trail in areas that are over a half-mile away from any other trails or road could introduce high levels of disturbance. This is the same with the deer. And another management implication shows that deer or elk are highly disturbed when dogs are present, and we always kept the dogs leashed. So try and imagine how high this level of disturbance might be when dogs are not leashed, when dogs are running after and chasing elk. So once again, here's a few more graphs. Down here is density, so over a half-mile from any trail or road, within a half-mile from any trail or road. There's about a 300-yard difference, so elk are alert about 300 yards sooner. And over here is our interval time. Once again, time between alert distance and flood distance. Over here is when we don't have a dog present, and over here is when we do. This interval time decreases on average by about 50 yards. So with that, I'd like to thank my advisor, Malin Vanderkirk, my committee members, Pat McGee and Kevin Blecka, my technician, Jeremy Kaloy, and my volunteer, Paul Rivera. I'd like to thank Western Colorado University and CPW for providing me funding that allowed me to do this project. And finally, I'd like to give a huge shout out to my two favorite volunteers, Topo and Arlo. I borrowed these dogs and took them out every morning with me, drug them out of bed at 4 a.m. and forced them to hike for up to 14 miles a day. Without anyone on this list, this project could not have happened, and I'm so grateful for all the help I received. And with that, any questions?
Thank you, Sabrina. So we'll start with a few questions for Sabrina. Folks can still flood in some questions for the rest of our panelists. We'll end with 10 minutes of questions for everyone. Okay, for Sabrina, can you share a little bit about the statistical significance of your results, specifically as it relates to dog impacts? Or if there is a statistic, if there weren't any statistical significant, why do you think that is?
Yes, so all the results that I put on my slides were statistically significant. When we think about dogs, we know that they're canines, they're predators. Ungulates, deer, elk are prey. So they're going to view dogs, whether they're small or large dogs, as a predator. This is going to increase disturbance, potentially, as they see a predator approaching. So rather than taking the time to check out what's approaching them, they're going to see a predator and they're going to flee.
Awesome, thank you. Another question. Thank you for your detailed explanations of your methods. Did you interact with any moose in your data collection? I know we have that picture on the screen. And why did you choose elk and deer?
Yes, I interacted with a few moose. I definitely have stories. That's a picture that I took myself. Um, Thankfully, we didn't have any bad experiences with moose, but a few close contact calls. But I chose deer and elk because they're widely accessible. I could have chosen other ungulates such as moose or bighorn, but deer and elk were accessible and easy to find and easy to study. I also did not have to worry about them charging me as I would with a moose.
Awesome. It seems that though elk were more responsive overall. Why, in your opinion, do you think that is?
Past research indicates that elk really are a lot more sensitive than deer. Deer can get a little bit more accustomed to people presence, and that's why we see them pretty frequently in town. I mean, every street you drive on in Gunnison may or may not have a deer in it. Elk are a lot more sensitive, and they're just not going to get as accustomed to deer. Or sorry, to people.
Awesome, thank you. Well, now we'll move into our group questions. I'm going to begin with just a question for each of the panelists first, and then followed by at least 2 questions for everyone to answer. So going back to Taylor. What do you think the different recreation users think about the monitoring and potential eventual management efforts of your project?
Yeah, so I think some of them are definitely all for it. And then you do have that, group of people that don't like any type of management. It is the BLM. We have that government oversight that people don't seem to like. But I did interact with a few groups of hunters, especially. In one of my slides, I had those pictures of all that trash, and that wasn't an ACEC. And I actually had a group of hunters that are like, hey, we like to come out here. It's great elk hunting, but there's trash everywhere. Can we coordinate with you to do a cleanup day? So that was really awesome. And I think, once people realize that it's for their benefit, they will definitely be way more receptive to liking the managements.
Awesome, thank you. Kristin? One of the questions also, this is actually more of a technical question for you. How do you ensure that your potential survey will work? How is the service out there? Do you use a QR code? Is it on website, paper?
Oh, yes, you'd like to know about my sampling methods. So my sampling methods for this survey are in both locations. Cell service is pretty spotty. So I have a sampling schedule for a technician to go out once every 2 weeks. There will be a kiosk with so first we'll go over the technician. The technician goes out every couple of weeks to talk to people and ask them if they'd like to participate in a survey. And then we collect their information and send them an email invitation to take the survey. There will also be signs on the kiosks with multiple methods to access our survey. So hopefully those 2 methods work out. I do some testing next month to see how this will work out, but I do hope that people will be able to access a survey with limited cell service. Each location has cell service with about 1 provider. So that might help me out.
Thank you. For Paul? How responsive are CPW and CDOT to collaborating to improve their data collection protocol? And then I'll add on my own follow-up to that. How responsive are they in their plans to actually create wildlife corridors?
Yeah, CVW and CDOT, I think they're very responsive. Especially CVW here in Gunnison. I've been working with Nate Sewer and Clayton Bondurant. Nate is a biologist, Clayton's district wildlife manager. Same with Kevin Blecka, who just left. He was the former CPW terrestrial biologist. I think they're very receptive. in the end, I don't think it's their call. I think it's the higher ups, and you know, in the end, it takes small groups, small communities to do a little small effort like this and actually show that the currently used methods are not working. Um, there's been on the totem pole of priority areas, Gunnison is actually at the bottom, and that's the reason why a lot of animals aren't being accounted for. And in the wintertime, you know, CDOT, CDOT's supposed to remove carcasses if they're touching the pavement. So that leaves carcasses on the side of the road not being accounted for. And in the wintertime, there's nothing saying that they're just plowing. They need to, they're already understaffed. They're not just plowing the carcasses on the side of the road and just leaving it and not counting them. And what was the
Yeah, I can follow up with my second part to that question. How responsive are they in actually planning to create wildlife corridors based off of your findings?
Yeah, I think they're very motivated in creating wildlife corridors. We do need a lot more research, and they're actually working on a grant to get two graduate students to actually implement the survey in the future for next year and following year. As we all may or may not know, wildlife corridors are very, very expensive. So if we can implement an actual survey, an actual protocol, and show that, hey, this is what's happening here. This is why we need it. This is why we need to spend the millions of dollars to do this. And, you know, help protect wildlife and people at the same time.
Awesome. Thank you. Sabrina, for you. Part of your research is really getting at this, well, I guess all of your research to some extent, interactions with humans. But some of what you're focused on, Sabrina, is related to adaptation or comfortability around human populations. In towns or high-use areas where ungulates seem used to humans and exhibit a lower stress response, might that be a useful adaptation?
Yeah, that's actually something that we've talked about quite a bit. And yes, we do see that deer get accustomed to people, but that's not the case with all wildlife species. We don't often see elk or moose or even bears or bighorn in town, and recreation impacts all wildlife, all ungulates. So while one of my species might get accustomed to people, we also see that they still experience disturbance. And studies like this need to continue on so we can better explain these levels of disturbance and how we can mitigate it.
Awesome. Thank you. Now a question for all of you to respond to in whatever order you guys would like to do so. Given all of your projects, what is your most important message to recreators?
For me, my most important message would be to please don't love it to death. That is a big issue. And also like leave no trace is a big thing as well. You know, pack it in, pack it out. We have a lot of issues with trash. And just respect the landscape, any animals that you come across, that kind of thing.
I feel like I have more to say to the recreation managers, but I think education and outreach is key. And so, of course, there's leave no trace methods, and there's being aware of your impacts and staying on durable surfaces. But I think even just understanding and identifying impacts like erosion or soil compaction can help you understand your impacts and the impacts of the people before you. Yeah, I actually have a little bit of advice. I don't read signs. I'm just gonna say that. But my advice would be like read kiosks and read signs, because the educational materials that people put time into and the regulations or the policies they have for that land were well researched, and they want you to know certain things or specific things about areas. So that's a message for myself. Mostly it's like read signs.
I'm going to kind of second what Kristin said about being aware of yourself and the impacts that you have. One of my favorite stories from the field this year was I was conducting a survey on deer, and I was a little ways off from a dirt road. And as we were taking our measurements, my tech just stopped all of a sudden and started staring. And I'm about 2 seconds from yelling out at him like, "Hey, what's going on?" when he shouts quietly at me, "There's a moose behind you." And I turn around, and sure enough, there's a very large male moose about 20 yards behind me. I'd never seen a moose before, so I was terrified. But after I got away safely, thank goodness, I discovered that the reason that moose popped up behind me and we hadn't seen it before was because there was a truck who had seen this moose and they wanted to get a better look at it. So they were driving and pushing this moose essentially right up into me. I love seeing wildlife as much as the next person, but we got to be aware of what we're doing and how we're impacting wildlife and the environment.
I think mine's gonna be a lot different from everybody else's. Sorry, what did I say? So, you know, not really reading signs or anything. You already try to avoid wildlife as much as you can. I think my advice would be like, we got the Gunnison Sage Grouse Strategic Committee meetings every month. We got the Raven Subcommittee meetings. If you're passionate about helping out the roadkill situation in Gunnison, you know, attend those meetings. Maybe if you see it on the ballot or something, I don't know, drastically like that, maybe vote on it to kind of help the area.
Awesome. Thank you to our panelists. You all did an amazing job. Appreciated hearing about all of your research. We are now going to break for lunch and we will return at, if I could get a cue, 1:15. Awesome. Thank you.